before then.
This is the cost of service workshop, and this workshop is going to review the cost of service. Good afternoon, committee, and staff and members of the public. Morning. Good morning. Okay, good morning.
Oh, please have the meeting be over before then.
This is the cost of service workshop, and this workshop is going to review the cost of service. It's going to review the goals of the cost of service study that was presented to the board, and it's going to determine, we're here to determine the appropriate way to develop the rates. The cost of service report only determines the cost to produce, to supply the services to the treated customer as well as the raw customer. The report also looks at the ability to provide costs down to the infrastructure level, the zone level. But there's a lot of assumptions within the report. And so we're going to have Alex walk through the assumptions that were used to put that together so we can understand. This Waterways Committee was formed and given direction from the board to produce the rates. And so our first meeting was the June 19th meeting, and we reviewed the Prop 218 and Prop 26 procedures. This is the June 30th meeting to come back and dig further into the study. And so what we're going to have is our consultant, Alex Barber. He's going to go into the report and look at the assumptions used in the report. And then depending upon those recommendations, I have another slide regarding the department budgets that I'll put up. And so the committee can get a good understanding of the costs that are being consumed in support type departments and the costs that are being consumed in departments that are directly related to the treated raw customer. So you can get an understanding of the total amount that's been consumed. And once we look at that, then we will discuss further the appropriate allocation basis. It's all an allocation base, whether you use one method to spread the cost or another method. It's all an allocation base. And the issue is, what is the most appropriate one to use? And so we'll have Alex look at the report and then go through the assumptions in the report, and Alex can give his opinion in terms of how he believes that came out.
I want to interject and just add a timeline here so that the rates committee and the public listening can understand sort of where the thought process on the timeline on this is happening. Today is not necessarily the day that we're going to be discussing a number, right? This is an overview of, as Marvin says, this is an overview of the study. Alex is going to update us that. We're going to talk about the process, the assumptions that he used, the findings that we found. As we move forward, we've got the month of July and into the month of August that we're going to be meeting and discussing these numbers and coming up with the rate structure that works for the district. The idea after this meeting is every 2 weeks we're going to be coming back and meeting with this rates committee. So again in mid-July, again at the end of July, and by the first or second week of August, which would be the 4th meeting of this particular subgroup, right? We anticipate having that package set. I anticipate bringing that package to the board of directors for a workshop towards the middle to end of August. So we've got about a 2-month period, and I'm structuring it so that we've got roughly four meetings, 3 meetings after this one, right? 3 meetings after this one to discuss this. You know, as we dig into the weeds and dig into the details, pardon me if I might sort of move us along to higher level activities and thought processes. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that is here and we can dive into. We do have 3 scheduled meetings after this. And within those, by the time we get to the second and the third meeting, I anticipate having probably another workshop or 3 for the public, where this is, 9 a.m. on a Tuesday, Zoom meetings, et cetera. It's hard for folks, I assume, to get to some of these meetings. Now they'll be able to listen and follow us, but these are discussionary work. These are discussion topics and discussion meetings. We do want to have the public involved, which they will be today, as they are, but we want more of an educational process moving as we start identifying the rates and educating the public as to what we're doing and why we're doing it. Yes?
There's some very important base assumptions that we have to determine before we get into the weeds of determining the actual numbers. Today is not the day for that?
Correct. Yeah. So we just want to keep it moving along, and I think the goal here today is just to make sure that we've got the cost of service overview, some of the objectives of the service study, high level evaluation of objectives, et cetera. This timeline I wanted to lay out for everybody, and I think with that, maybe we can. If there are any other questions?
And you'll be at every meeting?
That's the plan, yes. and available, if there has to be another call on the side. I personally think you're off to a good process. Sometimes agencies just want to get the rates done and then bring it to the board at the end or something like that. But I think it's nice involving the board every step of the way. You can get input every step of the way to make sure the final product meets, your objectives. But understanding, I've been through many rate studies, it's always a balance of competing objectives. Because, everyone wants to fund the capital project, but they don't like raising rates. They want to make it fair over here, but then, whatever you do has implications. So it's I think coming up with what's best balance at the end of the day when you weigh the different alternatives. And that's the other thing I'll preface. I'm about to go, I'll maybe cover some of the highlights, what we covered before a little bit, and talk about the cost of service findings as well. But, what I find with these rates, there's no single correct way to do it. A lot of people like to think, even some attorneys, that these are the costs and they should neatly tie into rates, but it doesn't work that way. And an example could be, you might have some costs, for example, for maintenance. Well, they're fixed costs for salaries and staffing, and should they be allocated based on their fixed costs, a fixed, rate, based on everyone's meter size or whatever, based on everyone's capacity needs? Well, that's legitimate. And another agency might say, well, no, we want people to pay based on use, so they have a volumetric rate. So we see that around California more so with sewer rates and water rates. One agency might have 100% fixed sewer rates. The other agency has 100% volumetric rates. They're both legitimate. And I think we're going to find as we work through this rate study, there's a lot of things that are legitimate, but I think what your district has done is more than almost, I think, any agency I've seen to really try to track the costs and identify which projects and which zones are certain costs are associated with it. Even you can make your best efforts to do this. There's always a substantial amount of cost that just don't easily tie to a zone. It's what we found. A lot of costs to be for support services or general costs, where is it helping this zone or these 3 zones or those 5 zones? It's just not easy to say. So, and that's what we found. So, just to, please interrupt me anytime. As I go through, I'm just going to rehash some of the things we found with our study from the last presentation that we gave. I was here back in late February, and again, the district did a real comprehensive effort to try to nail down, what's treated water costs versus raw water, and what costs are being incurred by different zones. And they went back and looked at 3 years of data at the time. We had maybe 2 years and 9 months of data. We've since gotten the updated data, but it didn't really change the overall results that much. And then it was, some comparisons, how the cost of services compared to what the rates are. And it looked like there were some discrepancies, but there was a bunch of assumptions built into that study. The two kind of key components of the rate study, in my mind, one are the big picture, financial projections, and where do your rates need to go to fund your cost of service, your operating costs, maintenance costs, capital costs. You as an agency have made some good decisions in the past, and also you've got some property taxes, so maybe it's a holdover. So you're getting a lot of benefits from some external funding sources from both the hydro system, which is funding all the upper division costs, and delivering the water supply to folks, and providing subsidies to your water rate customers, pretty substantial subsidies, and you're getting property taxes. Property tax owners aren't paying any more in taxes. It's just there's a small portion that comes to this district. So overall, we saw that water rates were funding less than half of the total water division operating and capital expenses because you're getting these external sources. So that's a great benefit for the district. But we've also seen in recent years, your hydro has been a profitable enterprise. So it was a good move for the district to do whenever they did it. But in recent years, the dependence on the transfers in from hydro have been increasing to try to help, maintain balanced budgets to the degree possible. In your water enterprise, where I think it was 2 years ago, it was like almost 11 million coming in from hydro. This year, it's almost 14 million coming in from hydro. And those are just unsustainable levels coming in. You do have some hydro fund reserves, but they're being drawn down. And my understanding is you need to maintain a certain level of hydro revenues for the whole FERC relicensing just to keep the benefits of that program going. So in recent years, there's been kind of a reliance on external funding sources that just can't go on forever. So at some point, the rates have to step up to fund the cost of service. And I know the district, even going back to prior rate studies that we've done, and there's always been, every agency, hey, what can we cut out the waste? And there's agencies have been doing this for years, and I remember hearing in some prior things about, that there had been some very hard looks at your cost of service and really trying to operate as efficiently as possible and cut out any waste as possible. Might there be a few cents here and there? I don't know, but it seems like your district had put a lot of emphasis on, streamlining and trying to be cost effective. So anyway, your water rates aren't funding the cost of service. You're relying on over 50% of these external funding sources, and in recent years, still a lot, yeah.
I'd just like to point out that as we progress through the FERC licensing process, the requirements of the FERC license are going to increase rather substantially going into the future. And at some point, we're going to have to face up to that and reevaluate the amount of money that can be transferred into water to support water cost of service. And that is a fundamental issue that's out there. We have to start grappling with that now.
I would like to reemphasize the only reason we went into hydro was to offset water rates. And so at some point, if hydro does not provide any benefit to water, then it's become a whole separate entity that's just another liability on the district.
And I tend to agree with that.
Yeah, and I think your hydro's helping in multiple ways. One, it's covering all those upper division costs, which the water enterprise otherwise would have to fund. So I'm forgetting the numbers. It's at 15 million or somewhere. So it's a lot of, all those costs might not be incurred. I think a sizable chunk of them. And two, it's generating all that net cash revenues on top of that. So if you add it all up and do the cost benefit, I don't know what your future, you're right, there may come a time where it's not a net benefit, but it certainly seems like it's been a tremendous financial asset to the district over the years. So getting into the cost, so when I look at things, I see, you can't rely on this, elevated level of hydro transfers in every year going into the future, also just gonna keep the hydro fund reserves away, and you can't do it forever. Can you do it for a short term? Sure, and the benefits of the fund reserves are accrued on that side are that it gives you a little flexibility that you could, your back's not against the wall, that you have to raise rates tomorrow, or you're gonna, be under behind the 8 ball. You have time to phase stuff in, and that's usually what we find agencies like to do. Try to phase things in gradually over time. Regarding the cost of service methodology, I think that was something that came out of some prior initiatives trying to look at, hey, what are our costs of service in the different zones? And, I already mentioned the district did pretty tremendous effort. But when we looked at the cost, they were broken down to a few categories. There are salaries and benefits. Salaries, benefits, and other non-operating costs. Capital costs, as assumption, those are funded by the property taxes. So when it came for salaries, when we got all the data and allocated to all the different projects and tried to boil it up to zones, treated versus raw, I'm trying to remember, I think it was a little over half the cost of salaries can be directly allocated to different zones. It wasn't all of them.
And now, if you're following with Alex, I think he's on the cost of service report on page 11 and 12. In pages 11 and 12, these are important pages because they establish how the numbers were developed that you're looking at. So, Alex, maybe you could kind of walk us through those bullet points very slowly, Alex, so we can understand how the numbers were put together.
Yeah, this was part of, your internal process of time tracking and having staff, identify specifically what projects, costs are currently working on. So, in terms of the data, there's over 200,000 rows of data that were kind of analyzed in this, and a lot of it came down to district staff making good faith effort to track salaries, what what other operating costs are being associated with different projects within different zones. And even on top of that, there was a whole time tracking analysis that was conducted, for, I think, the general administrative costs, where people made a good faith effort, how much are we doing treated water versus raw water, try to come up with a basis for how those costs could be allocated. So, all the costs were mapped from, I think, on Marvin's side and the whole financial system to the different service zones and projects, and we kind of brought it all together and brought it up within the zones and with treated raw versus water. But in doing that, that's the key thing. It wasn't, I mentioned a few times, it wasn't like every cost can neatly be ascribed to a specific zone. When we looked at, the salaries, there's only a little over half the salaries that could be, nailed down to that specifically for this zone or for that zone or this project or that project.
And when I say salaries, think about benefits too. So the salaries and benefits together, it's about $20-some million. That cost in itself, half of it, we were simply using the allocation percentage that we had known to assign those. And so that's what he's kind of saying, that to come up with a particular zone, you say, okay, East George costs this much. We've known half of that cost, but the other half and all those support costs, we were simply taking a known percentage and spreading those costs. And then to try and charge a zone like that, that's what he's saying.
So what I understand is that you took the cost that you could assign to the zone, and then took the other 50% of them and then just divided them equally among all the zones.
Proportionately shared.
Yeah.
Proportionally shared to the known percentages. So, in thinking logically, well, we know we can map half of the cost. Half of the cost, the treated department's maintenance, they've assigned their costs. But that same percentage, we took and spread that same percentage using the administrative people. And you will be saying that you will be essentially saying that the amount of time consumed by the administrative guys on the zones is the same amount of time as the guys in the field, which perhaps is a big assumption. So we can talk about other ways to spread that administrative amount. It's significant when it comes to how you develop the final rates. That's what Alex is saying.
So in a simplified explanation, if we only had two zones, one zone was 60% in the known cost, the other zone was 40, we then took the administrative costs and split them up 60/40 and applied them to those zones.
And it's not administrative only. We're talking all service-related activities of the district, so finance, purchasing, HR, all district-related activities that don't necessarily tie directly to, I've spent 8 hours of my day at the water treatment plant at George, right? That's a very specific cost that you can allocate to the operations and maintenance of a particular facility. So, I think that's kind of...
So Greg, maybe this is a better segue so that you can kind of get your head around it. So this is our 2020 budget. I can make it a little bigger. I can make it zoom. Can you make it a little bit bigger? Could we can zoom a little bit? Let me see. How about that?
Your glasses help, don't they?
Look at it.
A little bigger. Okay, so but the concept is, it'll be real apparent just looking at the way our district is structured, right? We don't have a HR and accounting staff for water, for each zone, or even for rec and hydro. We're all using the same labor. So in that regard, our budget, 46% of our budget or historical cost is support. Of the amount down at the bottom, that delivery, 54%, we're reasonably sure that we can determine treated and raw. Even to go out to zones at that level is a little dicey. But even at this, we're fairly sure CHIPS guys are treated. Am I right, Chip? Fairly sure.
So, our staff charges every day on their time card what facility they worked at, how many hours they worked at each facility. So, from the operations perspective, we're fairly confident we know what the costs are for operating the system.
Yeah.
Same with maintenance.
Yeah. But even CHIPS guys who are in the office don't know. Understand what I'm saying? The guys in the field do. The guys in the office may not. Right, Chip?
So there are certain aspects in operations, for instance, customer service. They spend a lot of time working in both, treated and raw. So it becomes just a guesstimate for those specific functions that aren't tied to any facility.
And up in customer service, that's why I have them up in the support area. The customer service department, they're up in the support area. So now, in this regard, when we develop our budget, we're developing our budget by department like this. However, our cost of service study is not developed by department, developed for cost all the way out. So in that regard, the 54% portion of those costs we're going to forecast out. Those 54%, it kind of makes logical sense to go with the portion that we were able to track for that portion. The top portion of the cost, the 46%, it may make more sense to go with a different allocation basis other than the bottom portion. That's what I'm saying. But the report used the same allocation basis for everything. And so that's what we're saying. So that's.
Yeah, I mean, in an effort to come up with something, and there's, talks behind the scenes, there are different ways of doing it, but to try to come up with something that was kind of behind the scenes, what was decided was to, if we can identify these salaries here, as they're mentioning, the rest of the salaries were proportionally allocated the same way. But no one knows if that's exactly the correct way to do it. It's one way of doing it. That's a legitimate way of doing it, but there are certainly other ways of doing it as well. For example, taking your, the unknown salaries and and on those benefits that parallel those salaries and saying, hey, we're gonna allocate these based on, customers or use or something along those lines. And in the prior rate study that we had done for the district going back a number of years, it didn't get quite into the behind-the-scenes weeds with, all the costs of service over and salaries, but there was a good faith effort made by staff to, go over all the different canals and pipelines and figuring out which ones were serving which service areas. And this one serves this area here, but the treated water here, the raw water here, try to break up those costs. And so, again, same as last time, there's a bunch of costs that were kind of identified as being for treated versus raw, but the ones that were not clearly allocated to each, after kind of evaluating a number of different approaches behind the scenes, it's kind of the consensus, working with the staff that, hey, let's allocate it based on, number of customers, which is one way of doing it, one of many different ways. So that's kind of underlies the prior rates. But then there is this whole process to reevaluate this. So anyway, so staff did this whole analysis, the salaries, the benefits parallel salaries, and they also looked at all the other non-operating costs from all the divisions, and all the unidentified costs were just proportionally allocated the same, and, that's just one of the number of ways of doing it. So I think that's one of the things I think we wanted to open the books, open the discussion about was, trying to figure out what would be the most appropriate way. And sometimes when we've done stuff like this, people want to know, hey, well, what are the impacts? What are the impacts going to be? And we try to follow through, what do the rates look like under these assumptions, and it created some substantial changes in the way things, compared to the way things have historically been done. For example, if you follow through kind of this approach, you identify that, that treated water is, I think it was about 54% of costs, and raw water is, roughly 46% of costs, but that's not the way the current rates are, so it would require substantial increases in the raw water rates and, like a leveling off of treated water rates. But the degree to which that would occur, it would make the raw water rates, I think it was in some cases, more than doubling in some of the zones. So a real big change, and that change wasn't based on, hey, this is the only objective way of doing it. It was based on, hey, partial objective analysis and also partial assumptions. So those assumptions aren't the only ones and don't have to hold. So we were looking to, explore what are some other, there are other options, such as using the number of customers or weighting it by customer demand, some way of allocating those non-operating costs. But I think there was a feeling that when we looked at kind of some of these draft rates, as we followed this through, that it's a big mess. And what I wanted to, another thing I wanted to mention, having worked in technical terms, technical, yeah. Well, from having worked with a lot of agencies, every agency has different areas within their service area. And some areas are far away from a treatment plant, some are closer, some require more pipelines and pump stations, some less. And there are, a few agencies out there that have zone charges. This zone costs more in this zone here, in this elevation zone, and over here we have a different treatment plan and storage system. But most agencies, and even some who had those different zones, have switched to trying to come up with a more uniform charge under the assumption that, hey, we're all in this together. And some of these engineering decisions that have been made about we're going to put the treatment plant here was put here because that was the most economical and cost-efficient way to put it. They could have put it over there, but they put it here because it was the best place to do it for engineering purposes. So does that mean that the house that's here should only have to pay for 1 mile of pipeline because it's near the treatment plant, but the house that happens to be over there should pay for 20 miles of pipeline just because of an engineering decision made? So that's why it seems like most agencies in California, we're all together, we're going to have kind of a uniform charge. And maybe at the end of the day, that's something you want to keep on the table, or maybe at the end of the day, there's gonna be some hybrid approach, where, hey, some of these costs are for zones, but some of them we're gonna uniformly apply to the customers in all the zones, see what that looks like. So we can look at different alternatives. I don't wanna just, say there's a million ways, there are a million ways of doing it, but we do wanna just start get the conversation going, start getting input. Where do we wanna start?
Do you want feedback on that issue? No?
Not exactly now. I think,
Just tell me what.
yeah, one of the charge that staff was given in April of 2019 was to develop a cost of service that identified specific allocations between raw and treated. And the best way that we could think about doing that was to specifically say, well, we have facility codes on all of these different facilities. It was a very, for the maintenance, the operations, hydroelectric, it was a very great way to just make sure that we allocate between raw and treated. As Alex said, the cost associated with all of our water deliveries starts at, I believe it's our reservoirs of Scott Flat and Rollins, and everything down from that. Is that right, Alex? This cost doesn't reflect activities and asset costs above Rollins and Scott Flat?
So the decision was made that the facilities above those points were hydroelectric
Yeah.
facilities, and those costs were borne by them.
Borne by them. So we're talking the cost below those two main reservoirs.
It is, and that's another kind of assumption, that all those costs supported by hydro are kind of proportionally, benefiting everyone down below. So the water is being supplied, at free, essentially, before everything, it goes down. But, there's other assumptions you can make even for how those upper division, subsidies could be applied. There's just,
Yeah.
there's no single right way of doing it.
Well, and I guess it would be fair to say that were it not for the existence of the hydro division, those upper division costs would have to be borne by the lower division customers. Correct. Allocated in some fashion.
Correct. So although,
That goes without saying.
yeah,
Yes.
and although we say that this year the hydro division subsidized the water division roughly, and the ratepayers, roughly $13.5 million. That doesn't include that upper division cost associated with bringing the water to,
Which is invisible.
and it's not all,
Did you quantify how much it costs?
no, we do know, but it wasn't related to the cost of service of the water rates. We essentially said the water that got to the upper elevation, to Rollins, all that infrastructure, all that operations, all that maintenance that comes to the water as that molecule enters the Rollins and Scott Flat is essentially free to the district ratepayers.
Maybe it's an academic exercise, but I suspect that number is a knowable number. And there might be some value in determining that number so that when we get into this discussion, we can tell the ratepayers, be aware that you are receiving this amount of subsidy from hydro, and the impact on rates would be thus.
And that's a fair assumption. We know in 2020, we brought, according to the report, $7.9 million in from hydroelectric reserves. From hydroelectric revenues. So out of the revenue package that Hydro received, nearly $8 million came from, we moved it over to water, and then we pulled the hydro fund reserves of $5.6 million. And now there's this other cost.
But the costs of operating the upper division are on the order of $9 million a year.
Right. That's right.
And if hydro weren't operating the upper division, all of those costs would have to be allocated to water to develop the resource. Otherwise, the lower division wouldn't work without the upper division.
So that's a number we can definitely look at.
And I forget,
We've looked at that number before.
We know the
Well, we
number.
know the number.
We know the number, and
It's not included.
it's just never been described in this fashion.
Correct.
and it's more than just the operating, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think there are a lot of other capital costs that get incurred in the upper division that again,
That's
if not for hydro.
That's the capital intensive division.
Yeah.
That's where all the reservoirs are, and the main canals, and all the really expensive infrastructure.
And And I think a lot of those capital costs from the hydro side, or the upper division, are funded from the hydro revenues. That's not all property taxes.
Well,
If I'm correct.
No, none of it's property
None
taxes.
of it, yeah.
Hydro funds their capital program about $4.5 million a year. And so that's all funded out of hydro's revenue.
that number's here on page, actually, it's in your report on page 3. It is, you know, in total, it's not by zone and it's not by facility that we have here in this format, but all bucket included, the hydro is, you know, 12.5 million of hydro's O&M is to the upper division activities. And then another capital projects in 2020 of 4.4 million is to the upper division activities of hydroelectric. So there you go, there's a near $17 million investment in upper division activities that brings the water to Rollins and Scotts Flat for then delivery to the rest of our customer base.
I would just argue that that's a very important number, that has not been talked about enough.
Everyone needs the whole story. They need to understand everything, not just what we want to know.
Now, a lot of those costs, to be truthful, a lot of those costs, hydro's electrical engineers and these people, if you were simply just bringing water, you're not going to need someone there to operate an electrical power plant. So you have to dig into it to see what the true cost is to bring it down.
Well, I would agree with that, Marvin. I would also caveat that to say that without those people, you're not getting the revenue from the powerhouse that is then being transferred into water.
True. Double-edged sword.
Like the water operation.
Double-edged sword.
It's a package.
It's a package.
But you could identify how, if it wasn't, how much is, because there's a couple things. One is the funding of all those costs that your water customers would have to fund, if not for hydro. Maybe it's not the full, whatever, maybe $15 million at 17.
Still a big number.
And then two is all the additional hydro, annual transfers to water. It's a tremendous benefit. On two fronts, just the unseen cost and the direct transfers that are occurring.
It's an important number. It's in the report, and although it hasn't been identified as this additional cost bore by the hydro division, of which it was created for, right?
Yeah.
And we just haven't, we've only talked about it in transfer ins, not the management and the operation of all that.
Because what I'm saying is, you need to turn this number into 2x4 and hit people up.
Well
Maybe
said.
they say, if you look at the dollar number the last 10 years, I mean, it's tremendous. Hundreds, 10, 20 years.
Yeah, we did it. Greg just had me pull that number. Over the last 10 years, it's been about $35 million
Oh, just in direct transfers.
in transfers, exactly.
Plus all the upper division costs that incurred, that could be anywhere from
Exactly.
12, 15 million.
Yep.
Yeah.
You could put a number on that.
Yeah. The one thing, it's nice to, it's great that this has been done, and it's been a huge financial benefit for the ratepayers. But I think as you on the board know, no matter if, people don't like their rates raised no matter what. Even if they're getting huge benefits from all this. People are used to paying a certain amount, and anytime you increase a bill, you can tell them all the wonderful things you've done with cost efficiencies and, getting, flying, property taxes to offset capital needs and the hydro stuff, but, it doesn't take away from, customer sometimes distaste for, if they're gonna have to pay more than they did in the past. So I didn't.
And it's partly because what they've been getting for free, they've gotten used to, and they don't see it anymore.
Yeah, and I don't think there's any, at the beginning of the meeting, there was perhaps, I'm not sure that there's a intent of this conversation to at all dissuade the hydro division from any upsetting the apple cart of the water rates and the water division. So we're pretty much in line with that.
So, I mean, where do we, maybe it is good to kind of open up conversation, start kind of getting into some of these, you know, what are some things that you would prefer to, we, but, you know, what do you, would board maybe want to see coming out of this, and what are some, and we're hearing some good stuff, we really, you know, identify these costs and maybe better know the customer base, but in terms of coming up with a rate structure, are there specific things, you know, alternatives that you want us to look at, or should we come up and try to come up with a few different alternatives and bring them back?
We know we have some assumptions. We have some assumptions that are out there. I think that, you know, we've got a few more meetings left. Next meeting, I'd really like to really dig into, you know, this concept of how we're going to structure the rates. I wonder if we can really look at some of the high-level assumptions that were made in some of these the modeling, and maybe we can get into the model. I'm not sure if you guys have seen much in terms of the modeling that Marvin has put together, and there's some assumptions built in there, and we can talk about some of those higher-level assumptions.
And I'd like to see about, I mean, we need to define exactly what are our goals, what do we want to achieve here? I think we just need to take out facts, higher level, let's say, what do we want to achieve? We have had rate increases for years after years after years, and we always say this is the last time we're going to catch up and we're going to be good. We never catch up and we're never good, and we always have to come back. And so that's one of the things that my constituents have told me, that we're tired of just paying rate increases. We're not communicating. We're not, as Nick pointed out, we're not communicating what they're getting for their money. And they're saying, wow, and so I think we should define our goals and objectives. I think we should look at different alternatives. What are other districts in our situation where they have both treated and raw water systems? How are their rate structured? You know, I know a lot of them do it by customer class. We don't do it by customer class. Why not? What's the advantages? What's the disadvantages? Let's look at what the different alternatives we would have to be able to figure out what would work best. Because we've always been short on time, and let's just, you know, shake it up and do what we've been doing forever. And it hasn't been working. With these rates, it has not been working. And then finally, we need to understand and communicate to our customers what they're getting for their money with the hydro, and what our plan is and how we're going to try and do it. And I think my people want to say, don't just keep coming to us for more money. You have to, and as you said, sharpen the pencil, but it's decisions we make on spending that drive these rates. And so I think we need to really put some skin in the game and really have some austerity in district as well, to try and help us to get coming with a handout saying we need more money. That's what I'm hearing from my
I think customers in many places feel the same, that, hey, we just did rate increases, now you want more, it's an ongoing thing. And, you know, from what I see, the rates aren't just, they're not just a one-time thing, and we're done, hey, we're good for 10 years. We've seen some agencies do that before. I mean, Grass Valley down the street there, I worked with them a while back, and I think they went like 10 or 15 years with no rate increases, and they just kept, you know, cutting down their capital program, because they still needed to fund their operations. But what's left is capital, and they kept, you know, not investing in infrastructure. And unfortunately, you know, these water systems are, you know, a tremendous amount of infrastructure out there. You've got a lot of pipelines that were put in, you know, 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago. You've got these treatment plants that have been aging. So all over California and the U.S., there's a tremendous amount of aging infrastructure that maybe 10, 15 years ago didn't require the same levels of investment that they do now. We're seeing, not quite a tidal wave, but we'll call it a surge in infrastructure funding needs, as you know, pipeline that used to be 60 years old is now 80 years old. And there's gonna be some kind of required, probably increased level of funding for your infrastructure going forward. So the funding needs, I'm afraid, are gonna be going up, is my sense. So, defer your staff on that for addressing these things. And you could always not, try to phase it in over time, but only for so long.
A little bit of history here.
Use the microphone.
Yeah, I'll just point out a little bit of history here, and this is pointed out by the grand jury rather eloquently in the 2007 report. The district, through the early 2000s, from at least 2000 to 2008, did not raise rates. We were criticized by the grand jury at that point for accumulating excessive reserves. Of course, the way we were accumulating those reserves was by not investing in projects and capital improvements. And so the grand jury basically told us at that time that you must step up your capital program. You must actually spend these reserves on the intended purpose, and hence our reserves have declined because we have converted those reserves into capital improvements as we were supposed to do. Now we're at a point where our reserves are lower, and actually as they should be. We had a board then that was rather shy about raising rates, and they did not do so. They could have done so gradually over time. They did not. Then I remember, Alex, in 2008, you came in and presented a cost of service study, which I personally thought was a brilliant piece of work, and we adopted a Prop 218 notice at that time that raised rates at 6% for 5 years, and that helped. And now we seem to be back into the same pattern of being too shy about raising rates. The idea of the 5% or the 6% for 5 years was to play some catch-up. It was catch-up for the many years in which we did not raise rates. And so that helped. But now we're backsliding again. And I don't see really any way around this.
There were some comments that Director Peters had made, and Director Wilcox. Our current rates are, in a sense, by customer class, customer by meter size. So we have a different rates for a 5/8 meter, a different base rate for a 1 inch, 1.5. So they are by customer class. Perhaps you just don't understand it. Our current rates are structured in such that we're recovering a certain amount in the base rate and a certain amount in the commodity rate by tier 1 and 2. So that's the current structure. A big decision would be how much of the costs would we want to recover in the base rate, which would insulate us from droughts and things of this nature. Perhaps, a lot of people know that's the current structure. One of the big questions would be, what would be an acceptable level of unrestricted reserves over the next 5 years? In other words, after we build all the assumptions in, what would be an acceptable level of unrestricted reserves over the next 5 years? Another big question would be, are we willing to use property taxes to service debt? And if we are, what would be the capital program that you'd be willing to back off? These are big themes. So, Director Peters, you're right. There's big questions and big assumptions that we got to make before we push the model out. What's the assumption on inflation? What's the assumption on the COLAs? These are big themes that we got to put in the model before we push it out. Otherwise, you're just leaving staff to make these assumptions, and we're not coming to those assumptions together.
And if I may, maybe I can simplify some of the goals that I've heard previously that we've discussed. And first and foremost, in all the discussions that we had about hydro, which is great, we started off this meeting saying that we cannot sustain hydro while dipping in $13 million a year. I think the district has always come at that approach saying roughly $6 million a year seems sustainable as a transfer into water. Anything beyond that, we're starting to dip into hydro's reserves, which we all have recently heard we're gonna need for the license when it comes out. So we need to stop diving into their pocketbook so heavily. Number two, the capital program and utilizing the district's tax revenue to fund the capital program was great, and it was strategic, because some of us lived through the ERAF process where the state came in, and if you didn't have those funds directed specifically to a project, they came and took those monies back to the state. Granted, we eventually got paid back, but the district, A, tried to protect itself by using our tax revenues and directing them to projects, and B, this was a concerted effort so that people who are paying this tax are potentially getting a benefit community-wide, as opposed to using these tax revenues just to go to rates only benefits those folks who are current customers. So we try to protect ourselves and say, no, we're getting the community's tax benefits and we're distributing those community-wide. At least that's one of our goals. And then last but not least, we have been dipping into our reserves to subsidize rates. And I believe during the last budget process, we even put on pause one of our policies where we stated how many months of reserves we were going to keep in the coffers. We have put that policy on hold so we can dip below it, and I think that is another goal that we need to start building those back up. So those are three very simple topics that I had heard us talk about in the past, and it's probably relevant to this discussion.
Is only property taxes fund reserves?
Property taxes fund the capital program.
Property taxes are
So
unrestricted.
what makes reserves then?
Our reserves are all the money we have at one point. However, of all the money we have, the restricted reserves by law can only be used to pay for restricted things, like capacity fees, can't use that to operate your system. Bond proceeds, couldn't take the 2016 bond money, operate the system. All other reserves are unrestricted. Property taxes have been, in our bond documents when we issue bonds, our property taxes are pledged for bond service. We're saying that legally. We're saying legally we can use our property taxes to service debt. We're saying it legally. And we can use it. However, like Chip said, our property taxes have been used to support the capital program, not to service debt. It's saying that they can't, but that's a process that we haven't used. So those are our reserves. It's just a matter of how the board takes that pool of money and then says, okay, these are what we are comfortable with. I don't like to think of it as we're subsidizing anything. It's just a matter of us spending reserves that we have built up before until we get to an acceptable level. And then when the acceptable level gets too low, build it up again.
So we've got restricted revenues, and then we've got unrestricted revenues, right? Are we familiar with those? So the restricted revenues, the unrestricted revenues are what we receive over from the hydro. But in order to build those reserves, it's the way to build those reserves is unspent funds, unrestricted funds for that particular budget year puts into reserves. And we have those board policies, right, with a six-month reserve package, and we're well below that in the 2020 budget. So we've got some policy activities that we need to keep increasing those reserves in order to meet our policy objectives. And Chip's right, is that we put that aside in order to bring hydro reserves and other reserves over, so we had to reduce that policy.
Look at it in a simple way. Let's say, for example, we have a budgeted $10 million project. Engineering bids this project out, and it gets built for $9 million. We have a $1 million budget surplus. That $1 million is then available to be rolled over into reserves. So it's really unspent. But so our staff are always trying to not overspend projects. That money then is set aside. Is that accurate?
It's accurate. I would just tweak it a little bit. If the revenues aren't big enough to cover the expenses, there's not anything to roll over, even though you're spending less than the budget. If the revenues are big enough, okay, even though
It does not guarantee it will come.
that's nothing to roll
For
over.
instance, a drought or
You know what I mean?
relief of
We
a
don't
drought.
consider revenue when we develop our budget.
Yes, we do.
Consider
We do
revenues.
the revenues, but again, like in our current budget, the revenues aren't big enough. Out of our current budget for 2020, what we were saying was that to balance the budget, we're going to use reserves. What that means is your current revenue structure and rates and fees and everything is not big enough to build reserves. Therefore, we're going to use reserves to balance the budget. Obviously, you can't keep using reserves every 5-year period. Then at the end of the 5-year period, the reserves may be too small.
Because I understand, so to clarify, these rates, it doesn't sound like they cover operations and maintenance of deferred maintenance of known things that we know are going to, like the generator rewind or whatever it is with hydro. We don't have money set aside, and we know, for 50 years, we've known that we were going to have a generator rewind, and it was going to cost a load of money.
But there are
And
pieces.
we could put money a little bit aside every year to save for that.
But there are
And that's
pieces.
what the big reserves that were for, was to pay for some of these big.
You talk about this as a year after year problem. We didn't actually start getting cash money for our hydro until 2013.
Exactly, yeah.
You don't seem to understand that. But the contract that we had with PG&E was that they helped us finance Eagle Bear. We built the project. They got the power for free for 50 years. And at the end of 50 years, we got the whole project free and clear. We got the water. And then we had the opportunity to start producing revenue from the power production. But in the old days, any costs, upper division costs, were carefully tracked by the district, and then they were billed directly to PG&E, who then paid for them. So that was the arrangement.
Done.
So we're actually in a fairly new situation now. You can't criticize hydro for not building reserves over the years because they had no cash income.
I'm not crazy. The district as a whole should have been considering these liabilities that were coming. I'm not pointing here in hydro in any way. I'm just saying that we knew we required these facilities, now we gotta take care of them. And they're gonna have long-term some pretty big expenditures.
Well, they certainly are, and we have an, as Director Wilcox said, we had an adequate number of reserves. We were forced to spend down on capital projects. We did so. We built reserves in the meantime with the hydro reserves throughout this period, and so we're actively engaging in building these reserves. We've got, I think, at the end of 2019, once the audit, we're at
62 million unrestricted reserve.
in reserves. Yeah. And they're tied to specific projects, and they're tied to, we think that it's going to cost that in 10 years, and we've got that on the radar, and we're going to work towards that. What I think we can't do, and which is what Chip alluded to and said, was that in this year alone, we pulled an extra $8 million out of hydroelectric reserves to fund the water rates. Whether it's a subsidy or whether it's an injection of funds to the water side of the house to balance that budget, that's what we did. And that's in addition to the $8 million or $7 million that we brought over from the revenue that the hydro received. We can't bring that reserve balance over. We have to get away from that for this next year, and we have to look at other opportunities to fund that delta. And whether that's through our base and volumetric rate calculation when we get to that conversation, whether it's through utilizing some property taxes, and we have a discussion on how can we offset some of the property tax that goes towards capital investments right now, and R&R and O&M, and pull it into operation of the system,
Debt service.
debt service, and these are some of the questions that this committee will be looking towards answering when we throw up the modeling that we have, and trying to balance this package out.
I will say also too, I don't want to cut you off there, Wilco. It's not wrong to issue debt, because you think about it. When we issue debt, the debt's going to be paid over about 30 years, 25, 30. That generation way out there is going to get a benefit of that debt. If you build reserves up all the way up to $100 billion, and you use all those reserves, say $50, $60 million, to pay for that infrastructure, that generation way down the road got a benefit to all that $100 million. That's what I'm saying. So it's not wrong to issue that, because the generation that's getting a benefit is going to be the generation paying for it way down the road. So it's just a philosophy in terms of how you want to do the infrastructure. It's not wrong to issue that.
I remember really well the discussions in 2013, on that one day, life changed for the district. We started to have a project that generated income, $20 million a year or whatever. Prior to that, it had generated nothing. And, we sat down and realized that we would need to build reserves for all of these various things, and we established what those reserves would be, and then we started squirreling away money to build those reserves. Prior to that, there had been no need for reserves, because PG&E was the reserve.
Right.
And so, if prior to 2013, if we needed a generator rewind, we would go and do it, and then we'd send the bill to PG&E, and they would damn well pay it. That was the contract. Am I correct? And
You don't need to generate a rewind for 50 years.
you need it more often than that. You need a generator rewind when you need a generator.
Yeah.
You don't stop and rewind the generator if it's working. You rewind the generator when it stops working.
Right, so that's not the point of it. But I want to clarify one thing about the grand jury. The grand jury makes recommendations. They have no legal authority to force us to spend our money. And we keep saying they make us spend our money. They do not make us spend our money. Just because those of you that
Fair
and
enough,
I
but
think that
their point
it's
is valid.
information.
But
It's information.
But in 2008, the district chose to take its recommendation and act on it. Whether it was nuanced of year or forced or not, the district at the time made the determination that they would accept that.
That's their statement.
They would accept that recommendation, and they acted on it, and that's where we left ourselves.
But, those are costs you would have had to incur anyway at some point, so it's not like you're spending money on things you don't need, you're spending money, reserves on stuff you would have had to fund regardless.
And so now we find ourselves in a situation where we, in 2013, started building hydro reserves. Before then, we never had hydro reserves. There was no need for hydro reserves, because PG hadn't yet gone into bankruptcy. They were a nice piggy bank. And I remember Bill Morrow working late at night, figuring out which projects can be charged to PG now before 2013 to get a lawn shop. It was great. So we tried to front load the change with as many of those projects as we could.
So I think, we've got a cost of service study that, we've got this report that talks about the total cost to deliver water. It goes back in time of historically what we've subsidized or what we brought over from hydro, what other revenue sources we use to offset the cost, so we're not billing the ratepayers. That includes other non-rate revenues, some timber sales, and some other grant programs that we might have that offset some of the O&M. But I think where we're gonna get, and this is good philosophical discussion and sort of setting the tone for the next few meetings, because in the next couple meetings, we're going to be digging into the numbers and those assumptions, and there are quite a bit of assumptions, to be made. Growth projection, right? Cap fees, there's different opportunities and discussion on, the different types of customer that we have, and so there are a number of these things that we're going to get into. Today really was setting the table, kind of getting this in our lexicon and thinking about this. I think we've got some discussion around how maybe a little more direction moving forward. Yeah.
It seems to me there's two fundamental assumptions that we have to nail down before Alex can start grinding away. The whole idea of zones and allocation, whether it's an even allocation or a zone allocation, we cannot produce a rate proposal without a decision from that.
Yes, correct. You're absolutely right.
And there's another, and I was thinking, but it will come to me. I'm getting with you, my old age.
In the meantime, can we talk about tables 4 and 5 on page 5? And do a kind of deep dive into these two things out of controversy? Sure.
More fun.
So just to wrap up what I was saying.
Want me to pull it up?
I'll do that.
Yeah.
But there are fundamental assumptions that we need to make determinations on. Otherwise, Alex can't do his work. We can maybe agree on them in this committee. I don't know. If not, then these will need to be brought to the board at some point. These decisions have to be made.
We need to define our goals and objectives and figure out what we want.
That decision I anticipate to be made next week.
Okay, great.
And you may want to keep a couple of options on the table. I mean, as you go through this, say, what if we did it this way, what if we did it that way, what it would look like? So that's to proceed. We don't want 1,000 options, just make it conceptual options.
Now I remember my other point. Thank you for triggering my brain. So there's the postage stamp versus zone decision. That's a fundamental decision that has to be made. The other,
It'll come.
And that's the exact terminology, I mean, that some other agencies have used. We use it, what I think we call it postage stamp versus, what was it called, the train ticket or something like that. The further you go, the more you pay. I remember working with the Mojave Water Agency a number of years ago. But that is a fundamental one. You're going to have to make it. It doesn't have to be all one or all the other. It could be, 50% zone, 50% postage stamp, or it could be.
But you can't move forward without that information.
No, you're right, because to develop the rates, we need to come up with kind of the financial framework for building the rates.
You have to have
We
your
have to make it,
assumptions.
exactly.
So we have to make alternatives as well.
And the other fundamental assumption that we're going to have to deal with is one that we haven't done a good job of dealing with, and that's the allocation in rates between fixed costs and variable costs. Right now, correct me if I'm wrong, but we allocate about 60% or 70% to variable, about 30% fixed.
37, 63 or something.
Whatever it is.
Not 50-50.
But in reality, Alex, the percentage ratio between fixed and variable is more like 75-25, is it not?
Yeah, I think we looked at this, I mean, some of the stuff we were looking at in a little more detail, so my memory's a little hazy too, back in January, February. But I think it was even higher than that when you look at your fixed costs. Maybe I'm just making up, should be a better finger on the pulse of this, but it was more like 80-85% of the costs were fixed costs. that doesn't mean that your rate has to be 85% fixed.
I understand, but we need, this is a philosophical, view of mine. We need to move in the direction of having our rate structure more closely resemble the actual allocation between fixed and variable.
Many agencies have been trying to do this, going back a number of years with the drought and, this California Urban Water Conservation Council, hey, we want your fixed rates low and your volumetric rates high to encourage conservation. So a lot of agencies moved, they reduced their fixed, they had more volumetric. And then, of course, when water sales went down, they had a lot of fixed costs and low volumetric costs. When water sales went down, their costs didn't go down very much, but their revenues were way down, so it forced a lot of agencies to do rate increases to make up for the mismatch. So there have been a number of agencies that we've worked with that, in recent years have been looking to, gradually increase their fixed revenue recovery to improve revenue stability and not make it 100% aligned with the fixed and volumetric, but improve revenue stability to give yourself a little more ability to withstand it.
So I guess my point is, these are two fundamental assumptions that we must deal with before Alex can crank out a rate structure, because the rates that are going to result from Alex's work are going to be fundamentally tied to these two assumptions.
And one thing I just want to mention about this also, when you're talking about rate structure changes, there's winners and losers. And when you're doing rate structure changes, and everyone has to do this with rate increases, some folks are going to get, we'll call it a double win, rate structure change and the rate increase. So, you don't have to do this, but for a number of agencies, they've attempted to try to phase in the rate structure changes and the rate increases, over time, so it's not, a one-time overnight hit, but other agencies have wanted to do it all at once. So that's something you can understand also.
And we did entertain that last 2-3 years ago, I believe. It's the idea of phasing in that
And that's
structure.
what we've always done. And then that becomes a political question of how much tolerance you have at any given time for extreme changes. I think the last time around, our rate structure was rather drastic. It was a big upfront hit, and I think people really choked when they saw that. In the past, what you guys proposed in 2008 was more gradual, so that you're trying to, create a sustainability curve, and you're below it at first, and you reach an equilibrium, and then you get to a point where you're actually making a little money, and you can afford to create some reserves, and then rates going into the future are much less. I mean, that, to me, makes sense. And then it's just a question of what is the slope of that curve, and how long do we get there, and are we heading in the right direction? Currently, now, we are not heading in the right direction. In 2013, we established hydro reserves. We started building up hydro reserves for things that we needed. We knew that we had license costs. We knew that we had to create a reserve for rewinds, et cetera, We created those reserves, and now we're sucking those down to support low cost of service water. I believe that is a disastrous situation, and that's what the board has chosen to do.
I pay over $100 a month for one liner connection. I don't think that's cheap water. I don't think that's very cheap water. I think we're right in the upper case of, we'll look at this, of what our neighboring EID, DTWA, how they structure it, and we'll look at how everyone else is doing it. We're not rock bottom cheap. We're right in the back.
We're paying about, what, $30 an acre foot for water? Yeah. But what's that acre foot cost in San Diego?
We're not south of the Delta. We're area of origin.
I understand.
It's irrelevant.
Let's look at
And costs are different, et cetera, et cetera.
One thing you just said there, I think, just to reemphasize, I mean, that really is kind of, I think, a philosophy that I think is good for looking at the overall finances. I mean, 'cause these rates are kind of the underpinning of the financial stewardship of the district. For all your operations and your capital needs, yeah, you could reduce capital needs temporarily, you're gonna have to fund them later, and same with rates, but, I mean, that's kind of the goal of what we wanna do, and Marvin, the financial models, kind of look long-term, figure out what are the long-term funding needs and what are all the revenue and expense sources, and have the rates, gradually move in the right direction, and periodically you come back and reevaluate, and you adjust course as needed. But when you put off the rate increases in the short term, you may be avoiding a little bit of political pain, but you're building up a bigger deficit for the future and creating a bigger problem down the line. And that's what we've seen some other agencies have done. By trying to hold the line on rates year after year after year, they could have done the 6% rate increases every year, or 8%, or 5%, whatever it is. But by not doing those gradual increases, they're falling further and further behind. Meanwhile, the infrastructure needs are, increasing even more, and then all of a sudden, it's faced with a need for a large rate spike, which are generally less popular with the populace,
Right.
But there are repercussions for all these decisions and assumptions that get made in the rates. So, I mean, we're not looking at the concrete rate at this stage. I think this is more preliminary, but, I mean, anything that you guys have to throw our way to start doing work, looking at, this is very helpful. I'm seeing some of this even just on the communication side about making sure that everything we put out there is, the message, what the benefits are. And I'm sorry to ramble on one more thing. As you increase your fixed revenue recovery, if that is the goal, what you're going to find is, it's the low water users who feel that they're being unfairly burdened by that. Because even though it's the same dollar increase for a high water user and a low water user, it's a bigger percentage of the low water user's bill. And kind of the message that I think the reality is that the low water user, when you have a lot of volumetric rate recovery, that in excess, that the low water user is getting a tremendous benefit from the rate structure. And if the fixed charges are lower than the fixed costs. And even if you increase your fixed cost recovery, from their perspective, hey, my rates are going up higher percentage, they're still benefiting tremendously. You're not making your rates go to 85% fixed, 15% volumetric. So, and that's got to be put out there, because you're going to get, I think, I see this a lot when
I totally understand your point, but the fact of the matter is that the first drop of water that comes out of your tap or at your irrigation box is very expensive. The second drop of water is virtually free. And so, I mean, the system works because the infrastructure is there. And that's the rub.
And one thing I think we do need to keep in mind is that if we don't communicate our message and let people know what we're going to be spending our money on, why we need this. I know that all of those one minor inch customers, which I don't know the number of them, you were going to get that information, how many of them there are, and in each classification. But in Placer County, they're going to say, we're going to drill a well. Well, thank you very much, NID. We have no interest in being invested.
So we've had that with other agencies where the concern is the rates go too high, and all the ag customers are going to pull out and put wells, and they're going to lose a revenue source. So I don't know the degree to which that occurs here, but that has been a concern for some other agencies.
That's what people have told me in my area.
Yeah.
They've reached their limit. Ag can't sustain itself. And ag's not, we do have some large ag customers, but agriculture in the Nevada and Placer County is like 10-acre plots with one miner's in, and they're producing an amazing amount of food. And if they can't afford the water, they'll figure out a way to do it without having to pay all that.
Well, and that's something that we need to be looking at as we roll through this. I mean, that's that price elasticity of our customer base. And we need to be careful not to create that death spiral, if you will, of loss of customers just to increase the rates, right? So we have to be cautious of those activities and what we're going to be moving forward with, for sure.
Do we have a specific goal for today, Greg, in as far as answers to some of the questions that have been brought up?
So today's goal was really to go through this cost of service, answer some specific questions of the process, the assumptions that were made, the component. I think we got into some of the higher level sort of theoretical, and we've laid a number of things out on the table. There are one or two of these goal-based decisions that we do need the full board's sort of direction on, and I think staff and consultants need that moving this forward, which I hope to get next week. You know, we've got some particular questions of page 5 and 6 on those graphs. I think we can cover those. I don't know if there's any questions of anybody in the public that we might want to entertain, but I feel like we've got, like I said, we've got 3 more on my calendar, sort of 3 more officially scheduled rates meetings where we're going to be digging in, and Alex is going to go back and come back with options and opportunities. We do have to build the communications platform around this and different workshops, and so hoping we'll create a Zoom workshop toward later half of July and into August around that.
Did we do a media blast and like all those papers that we're holding these workshops now?
We've posted this. I couldn't tell you if it was a
Do a
media blast on this
what do you
one.
call it?
A press release?
Did we do press releases to Auburn and Grass
I'm
Valley?
not certain we did it for this particular committee, but it is listed on our website, and
I think we should do it
we
for this
spoke about
particular
it.
committee and let people know this is what we're doing, that we get criticized for doing things in a silo all the time. We need to let people know what we're doing
Fair
and
enough.
invite the public to participate
Fair enough.
to the extent they can at this time.
Sure.
But to wait until a 218 to say, oh, here you go.
Yeah.
You know, there, you did that, right.
Well, that's not the intent. The intent was this meeting was really kind of a high-level brainstorm. There will be publicized workshops where we're going to walk through some of the decisions that have been made on this decision committee, right? These are all, you know, COVID, like it or not, these are all now videotaped with you know, input from the public. I don't know how many people are out
How
there.
many people are on it? 10.
Yeah. So,
Out of 25,000.
yeah. So, Alex, do you want to maybe just answer Director Peters' questions on this this overview, and then
Yeah. I just want to walk through them. This is pretty much, you know, this is the cost versus what the rates are, and so let's talk about what the assumptions were behind these tables and how we got these. What the numbers mean, like percent net rate, percent funding required.
Yeah, and there's a graph too that, I mean, I think summarizes it real simply again, but, yeah, if you look for, so this is for these 2 tables. The top one was for 2019, and the bottom one was for the, I guess, 2020 budget. And on the left side of the table, for example, let's say in 2019, this came out of the, you know, the financial model, how much money I'm trying to refresh my memory here, so I apologize.
No, that's okay.
Yeah.
I remember, Alex, the 2019 percent of total water operating expenses, this is essentially the forecasted amount of the operating expenses for 2019 for the water fund. Of that amount, that 64%, what we're saying is that the rate revenues is going to only recover 64% of the operating budget before the transfer in. After the transfer in, the rate revenue requirement, it's going to recover 101%. So Hydro is going to help the water department build a little reserves after the transfer in. That's for 2018.
That's 1%.
That's the 1%, yeah.
And the 2020 guy is,
Hold on, Marvin. So on the percent funding required before hydro, that 32,898, where is that number from?
the 32,898, that's the operating budget less hydro's transfer in.
Oh, so this column before that, percent total water operating expenses, that's not just total water operating expenses, that's total water operating expenses, including hydro transfer in.
Water's operating expenses, the transfer in to water is not an expense. The total expenses to water is 37.7. Water's expenses are offset down to 32 by hydro's transfer in. So if hydro doesn't have if water didn't get the transfer in, water's operating expenses would be 37.7.
So to state it another way, would it be true to say that without the transfer in of hydro funds, treated water rates are recovering 50% of the cost of service?
64%.
64%.
Yeah.
Some of the numbers tie into table one, which kind of shows all the revenues and expenses of the treated, I guess, of the whole water division here in this table. But you can see in table one, the total operating expenses of the water division in 2019 was about 37.7 million. And the total, the operating expenses in debt service in 2020 was about 45 million. So that's where the numbers come on these, the table that were just, tables 4 and 5.
Yeah, exactly.
What's the total operating expenses? Why the operating expenses? Because the district's policy has been that property taxes are used to fund capital. So it's kind of like the rates need to fund, are going to need to fund the operating expenses. But there are some other miscellaneous source of funds that come in. So that's where the 37 million and 45 million come in those other tables we were looking at.
Oh, 45 down in 2020. Okay.
Yeah.
Right, okay, I saw those, and then the funding, I got lost on the percent funding required before hydro and percent net requirement, what those mean, what the assumptions were between those. So we can come back.
Yeah, well, no, here's what it is, okay, no, I didn't like to press myself to the degree, I probably should have some of the detail here, but, on that table 4, for example, the operating and maintenance costs for the water division were $37.7 million, estimated for 2019. When you look at the rate revenues, they're only bringing in 64% of that operating cost requirement. The second column over, it says percent of funding requirement before the hydro transfer. Well, there are some other revenue sources that come in to offset the funding requirement from water rates. You have some interest earnings, you get a little bit of grant revenues, there's some other revenue transfers that come in. So when you back out those other revenue transfers coming in, there's 37.7 million of total operating funding needs. When you back out those other revenue sources coming in, not including hydro, that's where the 32.9 million comes from on table 4, the next column over.
656, so if I took 37.7 minus
32.8.
it would come up to be interest earnings and grants and other revenue transfers. So those three numbers add up to.
About 5 million.
Okay, I'll do the math later on that.
Yeah.
I just want to understand where they're coming from.
And so, even after you back out those other revenue sources, and every agency has other miscellaneous revenue sources, interest earnings, things like, some grant money here and there, it still came out that the rates were only funding, in 2019, only 73%. Overall, the water rates were only funding 73% of the operating and debt service costs. And in 2020 budget, the rates were only funding an overall 64% of what the operating costs were. So that's kind of what the rates were funding, in 73% in 2019, 64% of what the total operating funding needs were. But then there's the hydro transfers that come in and really reduce what the net funding requirement from the rates were. So in 2019, it was like somewhere around $10 million of, what was the hydro transfer? 9 million, almost 9 million was coming in from hydro. So after you put 9 million coming in of hydro, then it looked like the rates were funding what the remainder was. But it's a little misleading because that's assuming 9 million coming in from hydro. And in 2020, there was 45.2 million of funding needs on the water side. Back out those other miscellaneous revenue sources, the rates, there's only 41.3 million of remaining funding needs. And the rates are only funding 64% of it. But once you back out that, this in the current year is transfer, it was 13.6 million.
13.6.
Yeah, these tables were made for kind of a different purpose, but, so, the rates, even factoring in 13.6 million from hydro, the rates still weren't covering all the remaining funding. They're only funding 96% in the current fiscal year. Really, the whole point was that the rates are only funding a portion of the operating expenses, and they don't need to fund 100%. But looking forward, that was kind of the key thing, was that the hydro can't be, $10, $13 million every year. The sustainable level is more like $6 million. You can throw a little more there temporarily, but over the long term. So your rates now are already far below the cost of service, factoring in hydro and everything else. They're going to need to make up the difference, because you're not going to be able to get that this level of subsidy going forward. And this is kind of a weird table to look at.
Thank you.
I forgot.
Oh,
I forgot exactly what.
I didn't quite understand what the point of it was, and wasn't really described, so but I get it now, so thank you. And then looking at the table, the figure on the next page, the treated, the expenses. We're almost, in 2019, we cut every budget by 5% in 2019, and this is only through the first 3 quarters. And we're spending, and even in that austerity, when we were cutting our budget, we were still spending as much. So is that just a hard cost that we're spending?
Now, this table here is showing a different thing, Director Peters. This table is showing which type of customer is consuming the budget. So this is a little bit different. Yes, we did cut expenses, but this is the one that goes back to how we're going to handle allocating the cost among the customers. This is the one that handles that guy.
I thought this was tied to this.
Not tied to the
No,
number
this
itself.
Okay, that was fine.
And this table is the one that carries forward some of those assumptions we were talking about earlier. There was there were the direct cost allocations, treated versus raw, but for the costs that weren't associated, they were assumed to parallel those other cost allocations on the known costs, which may or may not be the way this will go forward.
So kind of back to the purpose of this particular meeting and moving forward, I think we do have to identify those goals, and we got to look at some of these assumptions at the beginning of next meeting and really define for the study, for the rate study, what it is the committee and a couple of these opportunities we need, I think, some board input on moving forward so that we can come to the next meeting really ready to roll up our sleeves and get into the meat of the funding package and the assumption model, the table. And really dig in and spend the time adjusting, amending, and looking at different assumptions.
And Greg, do those answers come back to this committee following a board level discussion?
Yes?
So this is on the agenda for next week's board meeting?
We will be putting it on a closed session agenda item for next week for discussion on a couple of these items.
So Greg, do we know the questions that we're gonna ask the board to give us the direction?
Yeah.
Because he can't develop anything
Yeah.
without that.
Yeah, and we'll have some guidance from the full board after.
And why would that be held in closed session?
My question exactly.
Why would that
Yeah,
be held in
but
closed session? I think there's strict rules about them, isn't it? Why am I saying closed session can only be for
I'm not
certain?
sure.
I'm
I'm not sure that this is closed session, material.
and maybe I'm incorrect, so let me
Let me check.
check that out, and we'll be discussing it on the 8th, one way or another.
I mean, these kinds of assumptions are base assumptions, in a way, I think that they deserve to be held out.
Okay, well, then we'll go forth, and, I mean, the idea is that this is, some of this needs to be a board movement on some of these assumptions.
Correct.
And so,
I totally agree.
so that's where we need to go. But, whether it's open or closed, we'll bring it to the board on Wednesday.
I think that's, well, Alex's feet are cast in concrete until we decide some of these issues.
In some of these issues, I find when it's at a board level, especially early on the game, it's nice to do it on a conceptual level as opposed to get into, I mean, I just do this. And also I find, unfortunately, sometimes board members, anyone want to know, well, if we make that assumption, what's the implication? Yeah, we like the sounds of doing it that way, but if it means, oh, wait a minute, we're tripling their rates, and then, so sometimes the assumptions have implications, so it's nice, I think, kind of conceptual to kind of know what the, kind of implications are, of some of the assumptions.
Well, I totally agree. For example, the zone discussion has enormous implications. If you were to employ a zone rate structure, those people out at the periphery of the system, people in Division 4, will be driven out of business, no question. And therefore, we need to understand the implications of that.
Chris, we have some members of public raising their hand. Do you want to take public comment or anything?
Are we ready for public comment at this point?
There's been a good high-level discussion.
Okay.
So, Michael Hillwell. You want to say his name so you can hear you? Can't hear me.
Michael, are you on the line? Michael Hillwell?
Yes, good morning. This has been a very interesting meeting, and I appreciate the,
He just got muted.
We lost you, Michael. Did you mute yourself?
well, I didn't think so, but apparently.
There you are.
Great.
There you are, we hear you.
Good morning. Thank you very much. I think it's been a very informative meeting and discussion. I appreciate the historical context that Director Wilcox has brought to the conversation. And I look forward to the discussion at the board level, but I don't believe that this topic is subject of a closed session. I believe, even if you have the option of having the conversation in a closed session, I believe that the ramifications for the district and the residents are such that the conversation should be in an open board meeting. So I look forward to the meeting. Next meeting is in 2 weeks.
July the 8th, Michael.
Great. Thank you very much.
Peterson, I agree with that.
Absolutely. Okay. Oh, and no more hands this time. You want to ask anyone else?
Is there anyone else? Is it star 9, Chris? Star 9, if you're on the line and would like to make a comment or ask a question at the time.
Okay. No more.
All right.
I have one thing to add about preparing for the meeting next Wednesday. I really seriously think we should be more structured than just have it a sent them all to both of you, if we could talk about why, what is our objective? What do we want to accomplish with this? And be upfront about, let's say, okay, we want to try and get it to a point where we can just have inflationary increases moving forward, or we want to, however we want to do it, but address Dr. Wilcox's these two fundamental things. But I wouldn't say we have to say, let's not consider this. I think that then we would have, I would prefer, because Alex, you've done this for many, many districts. Have you worked in some of these mountain counties that have irrigation and treated water and this type of?
Yeah, I mean, there's not a ton of them out there that quite have what you do, but yeah, certainly, and there's, I can't say that other agencies, I mean, often there's historical considerations that have been taken into effect. When we've worked with some of these other agencies, as well as this notion of trying to balance. So I can't say that the other agencies are necessarily going to be perfect examples that you want to copy. But, and I remember we did it with the last study also. We did meet with the ag folks, and I remember we did some surveys comparing what you're treated and also what the raw water rates were versus some of the other communities out there. So that would be probably part of this process too. But, yeah.
I think it would be helpful, because our rates, I don't think we've really changed the fundamental structure of our rates. And tell me if it's true, I don't know this, because I'm new. But we've pretty much kept the same fundamental rate structure.
That's not correct. We in 2008, we did change the fundamental concept of our rate structure. Prior to that, we operated on the theory that large users paid less per unit volume of water as they use more. So the 50 miners inch customer paid considerably less per miner's inch than the 1 miner's inch. We determined at that time that that was not a fair way to do it, that water is water, that you pay so much per miner's inch in variable charges for 1 miner's inch as you do for 50 miner's inches. So that was a paradigm shift, and Alex was instrumental in implementing that.
And also, I mean, there were some base costs that all the raw water customers had to pay. So, but yeah, before that, it was, I think, if using a lot of water, you got a huge benefit, and the small customer had ended up paying a much higher rate per unit per miner's inch than the larger customers. So it was an attempt to come up with kind of a uniform underlying basis for those rates, and the attempt to make it, fair for everybody.
So your statement that we've never changed the paradigm is incorrect.
Okay, that's good. I didn't know that. Thank you. That's helpful. Are we going to be able to look, I know we have a lot of contractual, like MOUs, and, and we have different customers, like wholesale type customers of that. Are we going to be considering those, or our capacity charges, or any of these other things that feed into revenue that aren't just rates? Or are we going to just, are we going to look at it comprehensive that way, or are we going to just say that rate here is going to pick up the whole group?
Well, Director, the capacity fees are not a part of the rates, so they can't be used to operate the system. So the capacity fees is not a part of this. They can't be used to operate the system. But I do agree that we probably should narrow down the fundamental questions that we're trying to have the board address. Fundamental questions, that we're trying to have the board address. Like, one of the big ones would be, what is an acceptable level of unrestricted reserves over the 5-year period? So that's key in terms of what is an acceptable level of unrestricted reserves over the 5-year period. And I believe that's a key assumption.
Isn't some of that set by board policy already?
Yes, it is, but it can be changed during this time, because we're looking at the next 5 years. And so as a result of that, what is the acceptable level?
I think there's a couple fundamental questions that we need to ask the board. One is the zone-based versus the SAM.
Yeah.
One is this theoretical concept of the base rate and percentage base rate volumetric.
The allocation percentage.
Yeah, the allocation percentage. As we develop into further and further into this concept, remember, we're going to be identifying other options and alternatives where more funding can perhaps come in to help subsidize some of the rates. You've identified a couple right? Just now, there's some policy-related activities, some of which would need to be brought back to the board for concurrence, right? What we don't want to do is, the board's given this rate committee the authorization to go forth with the study and develop a rate package. There's certain fundamental elements within the rate package that we believe we need some board concurrence on, so that we don't get to the end of August with we're gonna set that policy aside, and we're gonna increase that, and we're gonna decrease that. I think as we move forward, we're gonna identify some of these other milestones or these other activities that may very well require board concurrence before we get to the end of August, and so that when we bring it back, we've got, we're marching down the line where if there are some fundamental changes to our policies or practices that are going to require the board to have some form of a say on, if it is changing a policy, for instance, then that is a board decision, and it's not the decision of a committee, right?
I totally agree. And I fully support bringing these two questions to the full board as soon as practical, because we need to move through this rates process so that we can roll into the budget process. We can't really formulate a budget without some certainty as to what rates are going to be, because how the hell you project your income if you don't know what your rates are going to be? Then Marvin's hands are tied and Alex's hands are tied. So we must resolve these issues next week.
Another big fundamental question is, what is the acceptable level of the size of debt we're going to issue over the next 5 years? Because we're going to have to issue some. So all of that's a big question.
And my understanding is that, and Alex, correct me if I'm wrong again, because that's probably it, but it doesn't have to be black or white. It doesn't have to be fixed versus, postage stamp versus zoned, or it doesn't have to be.
That pretty much does.
I don't think it does. And maybe it does. It seems like there's hybrid. Life lives in a gray area.
I think there are a lot of legitimate ways of recovering costs, and some of them conceptual, postage stamp versus zone, but, even from doing this cost allocation exercise to try to nail down the cost of service, some of the costs can be nailed down per zone, other ones are a little more gray area. So I think you could have we're going to use these per zone, but these we're going to apply to everybody. So there could be alternatives, but I think the goal is, and I've got a whole list of some of these topics, and maybe we could talk behind the scenes and kind of nail down what we want to, some of these big picture conceptual inputs we want to get so we can move forward on this. But what we'll do is, I think, take that information and use it to kind of come up with the rate model and financial model, and then you can see what it looks like, and then there may be, this is generally good, but can we do anything else to phase the rates in more gradually? And so there may be a little more back and forth later on based on these policy assumptions, because you might not like 100% the results right out of the gate. You can much more about the policy assumptions. So there'll be room, in my mind, to come back and reevaluate and look at things so you can tweak things a little bit later on.
Yep.
I
agree. I agree with that. So perhaps with that, if there's no questions on the public, we can close this meeting. First race committee meeting.
Thank you. This
Today.
This has been a high-level discussion, but very fruitful. Thank you.
Good.
Thank you.
I'm glad.
And thank you, Alex. And Marvin and Jimmy.
Okay. Thank you all. We'll close the meeting.